Okay, this is Unit 4 lecture of Russian Church History class, and we will be talking today about selected personalities of the Metropolitans, of the leaders. I did mention that there are debates who was the first Russian Metropolitan, right? And sort of conventionally Church believes that it was Metropolitan Mikhail. And of course, majority of the Russian Metropolitans from 1988 until 1448, when the Russian Church became after Cephalus, were the Byzantines. I'm saying it specifically not Greeks, because, for instance, there are theories that the first Russian Metropolitan Mikhail was of the Arabic origin. So I don't know if it's not Arabic, but he was like of Syrian origin. I'm sorry, that should be better, of Syrian origin, right? So, but culturally they were Byzantines, and it was probably an advantage because they were not that involved in the inner Russian policies, in the inner Russian conflicts, and they were better capable of setting up higher Christian standards of Christian life and preaching gospel more efficiently, right? But still, it was a high target to shoot, because very few people knew how to read, and mostly people would depend on oral reception of information, what they would hear in church, what they were explaining in church. A live sermon did not exist. Basically, people would just hear comments from fathers, right? So after the Mongol invasion, we learn about Metropolitan Kirill, right? Metropolitan Kirill, he was a Russian nominee from Russia, but nevertheless he was consecrated in Nicaea in the 1230s, because Constantinople was under Latin's control at this time. So he returned to Russia, and he was extremely busy with visitations, with pastoral visitations, with going from one place to another and working on the restoration of the church life. The church life actually had now center in Vladimir, in northeast of Russia, because Kiev was reduced to just 100 of courts. So it's really, since then we can trace this division for Ukraine and Russia, because now Kiev ceased to be the capital of the entire Kievan Rus, and now a new development happened in east north of Russia. So initially the Metropolitan See was moved to Vladimir, and that's where Metropolitan Cyril's see was, right? So he traveled a lot, and we also learn about the first Russian council that we have some information. This is Council of 1274, and this council is known because we have acts of it, and we can learn about church life from those acts. For instance, deacons were not allowed to take particles during proscomedia. So, and also moral dropped rapidly in the wake of the Mongol invasion. For instance, it was prohibited to perform funerals for those who were killed during fist fights. So, and also it was prohibited to dilute chrism with oil, because chrism was a high commodity, and some churches were destroyed as a result of Mongol invasion. And some priests, they had to conduct services by their heart, because even before books were also high commodity. Not all very few churches had the full set of liturgical books, and now we see that situation even worsen. So he died while he was traveled. His church again died while he was visiting his diocese, and he was succeeded by Metropolitan Maxim, who was Greek, right? And in this situation, Prince Yuri of Galich from the West Russia, which is approximately in the vicinity of modern-day Lviv in Ukraine, so it's like the Polish border of Ukraine. He sent his candidate to be nominated, right? And he sent his candidate Piotr to Constantinople, but after Metropolitan Maxim died. So we are talking about the very beginning of the 14th century. It's Metropolitan Peter's tenure was from 1305 until 1326. So the Byzantines decided to deal shrewdly with this situation, and they rejected a candidate of the great Russian prince from Vladimir, who also sent his candidate Gerontius, but they consecrated Metropolitan Peter for the entire Russian Church. And this is important because from here we see a direct route to the development of Moscow as the supreme center of the Russian land. So when Metropolitan Peter came to Vladimir, great Prince Michael of Tver, who sent his candidate Gerontius, was furious because his candidate was rejected. And Peter was an outsider, somebody who came from almost from foreign land, because Western Russia was very different than Vladimir Rus. So, and in this situation, he didn't want to give him any support, Grand Prince Michael, to the extent that he even summoned a council against Metropolitan Peter, accusing him in simony. So, in this situation, a small principality of Moscow used the situation to its advantage. So, Prince of Moscow, Ivan I, he competed against Michael, and Michael was associated with old, well-established principality of Tver, and Tver is between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in order to compete against Michael and receive approval from the Mongols, Prince Ivan, he needed support of the only canonical Metropolitan, because if you would have secure support of this Metropolitan, you basically have 50% of success, because there was single Metropolitan. If he's blessed somebody and doesn't bless this person's opponent, it means a lot. So the whole situation helped with this setup, and Metropolitan Peter became a friend of Prince Ivan I, who also was able to win a license from the Mongols. And with this license also, he was in charge of taxing population and delivering those taxes to the Mongols. And by taxing the Russian population, he also enriched Moscow, because he taxed people like twice. So he would deliver whatever the Mongols would expect, but also he would make sure that Moscow will become rich. So enrich Moscow, and by doing this, he elevated Moscow from the just small principality to much more significant player. And Metropolitan Peter was very helpful, to the point that he was canonized very soon after his death and buried in Moscow in the Dormition Cathedral. So by doing this, he already set trend and also demonstrated that Vladimir is not going to be the major see of the Russian Church. So after Metropolitan Peter, another Byzantine Metropolitan came from Constantinople. His name was XiV-XV, and his tenure was from 1328 until 1353. So Metropolitan XiV-XV, he decided to continue support of Moscow, and during his reign Moscow became the major seat of Russian great princes. So during his time, a diocese was established in Sarai, which is near the Caspian Sea, and that's where the capital of the Mongol horde was. And Mongols, they were very tolerable to all religions, as long as people are eager to also respect their rights. But they would not really provoke any acts of hostility, but I mean, only in cases when they wanted to get rid of a Russian prince, they would try to provoke his reaction as a Christian, and then they would accuse him in disloyalty and kill. But they didn't really force people to accept their religion, because they believe that people are entitled to their own religion. So therefore there were many converts from Mongols, and those converts, they became part of Russian aristocracy later on, Russian noble families. Right, so Metropolitan XiV-XV was the one who canonized Metropolitan Peter, and he also brought up Saint Alexis of Moscow. Saint Alexis of Moscow was his secretary, his cell attendant, and he succeeded to Metropolitan XiV-XV, and his tenure goes from 1353 until 1378. Right. The problem with the elevation of Moscow was that Moscow could not really master good relationship with the Orthodox in Lithuanian lands. You do remember that Lithuania peacefully annexed southern Russian principalities, and Kiev was part of the Lithuania. But Lithuanian princes, particularly this time Lithuanian Prince Olgerd, he wanted to be in full control, and he doesn't want, as it is for instance now case in Ukraine, he doesn't want to have a church that has its center elsewhere. Right? He really doesn't really want to be under Moscow, and Saint Metropolitan Alexis somehow proved this case true, because he could not dissociate himself from the Moscow policy of Prince Ivan the Okay, and Saint Alexei, he went to to Sarai, and he healed mother of the Khan. Her name was Teidula, and we don't know much about this. There is an English a movie with English subtitles, which is called Horde, Horde, about this trip by Saint Alexis. I really encourage you to watch this strongly Christian at the same time artistic movie. And he was the first hierarch of the church of Saint Sergius of Radonich, who was at this time alive. And also, as I said, he would go to rival territories. For instance, Nizhny Novgorod in the Volga River revolted against Moscow, and Saint Alexis sent Saint Sergius of Radonich, and he interdicted on behalf of Saint Alexis all churches there in Nizhny Novgorod, which was very unusual, sort of medieval Western thing, not unusual for Russia. Saint Alexis was godfather, and also he was a mentor of Dmitry Donskoy, who is a heroic Russian figure, a big deal for Russian mythology, in sense that Saint Dmitry Donskoy, he won the Battle of Kulikovo, and this was for the first time. This battle was won in 1380, and for the first time Russians seriously beat Mongols, and this is considered to be the point of no return, that Russians would not carry on, would not continue with subordination to the Mongols starting from this point. Okay. So when Dmitry Donskoy died, when Saint Alexis died, right, in 1378, the Byzantines had already Metropolitan resided in Kiev, in Lithuania, who was supposed to go to Moscow to succeed Saint Alexis, and it was Metropolitan Cyprian. So, but when Metropolitan Cyprian arrived, right, he didn't get along with Dmitry Donskoy, so Dmitry Donskoy sent him back, and it's already gives you idea about dynamics. So as soon as the Russian church the Russian state would be freed from the Mongol domination, the church would be enslaved. So basically it was direction towards this, because church was really needed during the Mongol domination. It wasn't really on the table to control the church. Basically both church and the Russian state work hand in hand, but as soon as the inner threat would disappear, the state would subjugate the church. I think it's sort of natural instincts of the church and states. They kind of, the church would never be a winner in the Orthodox Church in this world, and state would always dominate. So, right, and you see all those divisions right now towards the end of the 14th century. So Lithuania is on its own, right, and Lithuania is under the ecumenical patriarchate directly, and the Russian church is kind of reluctant to accept guidance from from Constantinople, and we see already development of this further trend, right, when Metropolitan Cyprian was sent back to Lithuania, Dmitry Donskoy, who is a saint of the Russian Church, he appointed his own candidate, Pimin, right? He appointed his own candidate, Mityai, who was a celibate priest. So he sent his Mityai to Constantinople, but he died on the way to Constantinople. Therefore, this delegation promoted one archimandrite who was there, Archimandrite Pimin, to be consecrated. So, and they decided among themselves without consulting Dmitry Donskoy. So when Pimin arrived, Dmitry Donskoy was furious again and sent him away. So he sent him away, and he invited invited Cyprian, right? So, and then he himself died. Right. He invited Cyprian, right? And soon died himself, right? So therefore, Metropolitan Cyprian remained the single Russian metropolitan until his death in 1410, I think 1406, right? And he is known as a liturgiologist. He translated a number of services. He was originally from Southern Slavs. Some people say he's Bulgarian. He was Serbian. Again, he was a Byzantine culture, a Byzantine person by his culture. So, and also during his reign, Russian liturgical typica was changed from typica on St. Fyodor of Studios for the typica of Holy City, for Agia Polite typica, or like St. Sabas typica, right? So, and he succeeded by Metropolitan Photius. Both Cyprian and Photius had advantages over Metropolitan Alexius because they were persona grata in Kiev. They were considered people whom they could trust in Kiev because they were not of Russian origin, and they were persons acceptable for Lithuanian great princes. Okay. So, and from here, from Metropolitan Isidore, from Metropolitan 40, one of the next ones, the Metropolitan whom I should mention is Metropolitan Isidore, who was a Greek from Peloponnese, who arrived to Moscow very soon before the end of the Byzantine Empire in 1436. So in 3-year time he went to Ferrara Council, which is an ecumenical council of the Roman Catholic Church, and at that council he participated in discussions, and he accepted union with Rome on behalf of the Russian Church. Then he came back as a legate of the Pope of Rome, and Polychronia was chanted in the Dormition Cathedral for the Pope of Rome. But the great Russian prince Basil the Blind was unhappy with this, and he sent him away. And then Russians didn't want to take any more metropolitans from Byzantium, and in 1448 they themselves promoted their metropolitan Jonah, consecrated him without consulting the Greeks, and then they wrote an apologetic letter to Byzantium, and we don't know whether this letter was sent or not. There are drafts of it, but they never mentioned union or something as a reason. It later on started to be used as a union for this, as a reason for this separation, but basically they were apologetically explained that they don't know what was happening, what was going on in the Byzantine Empire. So since communication were very bad, they just decided that they would be better off on their own. Right. So this gives you idea about major metropolitans of the Mongol period, and brings us to the very important stage in the history of the Russian Church, its independence. Thank you very much for your attention.